The scream echoed across the marble lobby. "Absolutely not!" Heads turned instantly. The Sterlington Grand Resort was not a place where people raised their voices. It was the kind of place where voices lowered automatically, where conversations happened in soft tones and polished smiles. A palace of quiet luxury. Crystal chandeliers glowed overhead like frozen sunlight. Marble floors stretched across the lobby so perfectly polished that every step reflected back at you. Expensive artwork framed in gold hung along the walls. Even the air smelled expensive. Imported jasmine and fresh linen drifted through the space like an invisible reminder that this building existed for people who could afford perfection. But in the center of that calm luxury, something had just shattered it. A blonde woman in designer heels pointed across the check-in line like a queen issuing judgment. "Move them," she snapped sharply. "I refuse to stand behind that." The word hung in the air. People exchanged glances. Everyone knew exactly who she meant. Standing quietly at the front desk was a black couple. They weren't loud. They weren't causing a scene. They had simply arrived at the hotel 10 minutes earlier and were calmly checking in. Dr. Emmanuel Carter stood tall in a tailored navy suit, his posture straight, his glasses resting lightly on his face. And his calm expression suggested someone used to stressful situations but unwilling to be rattled by them. Beside him stood his wife, Nicole Carter, wearing a cream-colored dress that was elegant without trying too hard. Her hair was neatly pinned back, and her quiet confidence gave the impression of someone who understood exactly who she was. But to the woman shouting across the lobby, none of that mattered. Victoria Sterling had spent her entire life walking into rooms where people stepped aside automatically. She was the daughter of a powerful family connected to the Sterlington Hotel empire. A socialite, a board member, a woman who had never been told no in any meaningful way. Her husband, Chadwick, stood beside her with his arms folded across his chest and the smug confidence of someone who had inherited privilege without ever questioning it. Behind them, their teenage children leaned against their suitcases, scrolling through their phones with bored expressions. Victoria tapped the marble desk impatiently. "I said move them." The young desk clerk behind the counter blinked nervously. "Mrs. Sterling. They were here first." Victoria's smile disappeared. "My family always goes first." Nicole stiffened slightly. Emmanuel slowly turned to face the woman. "Is there a problem?" he asked calmly. Victoria looked him up and down in a long, deliberate scan. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to press down on everyone in the lobby. Chadwick broke the silence with a mutter that was loud enough for everyone to hear. "People like you shouldn't slow down the line." Several guests gasped quietly. Nicole took a step forward. "We've done nothing to you." Victoria tilted her head slightly, her expression cold and unimpressed. "But you're in my way." A bellhop who had been pushing a luggage cart nearby stopped moving. Two tourists standing near the elevators exchanged uncomfortable looks. Moments like this had a way of spreading tension through a room without anyone saying another word. The lobby manager approached quickly, clearly aware that things were about to escalate. He knew the Sterling family. Everyone in the hotel industry knew the Sterling name, their donations, their influence, their wealth, and unfortunately, his career depended on them. He cleared his throat carefully. "Sir, ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside." Nicole stared at him. "You're asking us to move because she wants us to?" He looked down at the marble floor. "I'm following protocol." "What protocol?" Nicole asked softly. "Privilege." The question hung in the air. Guests shifted uncomfortably. Someone whispered, "This is wrong." But no one stepped forward, because racism in public rarely survives on courage, it survives on silence. Victoria smirked. "See? That wasn't so hard." Emmanuel gently squeezed Nicole's hand. "Let it go," he murmured. Reluctantly, they stepped aside, dignified, quiet, but unmistakably humiliated. Victoria brushed imaginary lint from her coat. "Now," she said sweetly, "check us in." The clerk hesitated for a moment before reaching toward the keyboard, but just as he began typing, Victoria paused. Her eyes drifted toward the Carters again. A slow smile appeared on her face. "Actually," she said slowly, "I don't feel comfortable with them being here." The manager blinked. "Ma'am?" Victoria crossed her arms. "They're making me feel unsafe." Nicole's jaw dropped. "Unsafe?" A security guard approached carefully. "Sir, ma'am, we're going to have to escort you outside." Nicole looked at Emmanuel. "Are we really being kicked out?" He nodded slowly. "But not for long." Victoria laughed loudly. "Imagine thinking you belong here." Her son raised his phone slightly. Recording. Nicole felt a burning pressure behind her eyes, but she refused to cry. Not here. Never in front of people like this. The glass doors opened as security guided them out. The moment they stepped outside, the doors slid shut behind them. Nicole stood still on the pavement. The evening air felt colder than it had moments ago. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then her voice broke. "Emmanuel, I'm so tired." He turned toward her. "Tired of what?" She stared through the glass doors toward the glowing lobby. "Tired of proving we belong in places our money already paid for." Her eyes glistened. "We worked our entire lives to build what we have, and it still isn't enough." Emmanuel listened quietly. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "It's enough," he said calmly. He opened a contact labeled CEO. Private line, Nicole noticed. "Now?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Now." The phone rang once. Then the line clicked. "Emmanuel," a voice answered warmly. "Tell me you and Nicole arrived safely." "We arrived," Emmanuel said evenly, "and then we were escorted out." Silence. "What?" The Sterling family didn't like the sight of us in the check-in line. Mark Hastings exhaled slowly. "Are you still outside?" "Yes." Mark's tone changed instantly. "Stay there." Nicole folded her arms. "What happens now?" she asked. Emmanuel glanced back at the glowing Sterlington sign above the entrance. "They're about to learn who they just threw out." Inside the lobby, Victoria was growing impatient. She tapped her heel against the marble floor repeatedly. "What is taking so long?" she snapped. The manager's phone buzzed suddenly. He answered immediately. "Victor speaking." "Victor," said the voice on the other end. "This is Mark Hastings." Victor straightened instantly. "The CEO." "Yes, sir." "I understand you escorted 2 guests off the property." Victor hesitated. "Yes, sir." "Mrs. Sterling said she felt unsafe." There was a long pause. "I'm 10 minutes away," Mark said calmly. "Do not check the Sterlings in." Victor blinked. "Sir? And Victor? Yes? Do not let the couple you removed leave the property." The line disconnected. Victor slowly lowered the phone. His stomach twisted, because suddenly he had the terrifying feeling he had just backed the wrong side. 10 minutes later, a sleek black SUV pulled under the hotel entrance. Mark Hastings stepped out. No smile. No greeting. Just purpose. He walked straight through the lobby. "Where are they?" he asked. "Outside," Victor replied nervously. Mark turned immediately and walked back out. Nicole and Emmanuel looked up as he approached. Mark stopped in front of them. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "This should never have happened." Nicole shook her head. "You didn't do it." "But I allowed a culture where it could," Mark replied. He gestured toward the doors. "Saw it come inside." The 3 of them walked back into the lobby together. Conversation stopped instantly. Victoria noticed them and scoffed. "Oh, good, they're back," she said loudly. "I was just explaining to your staff that these people were—" Mark walked straight past her. Then he turned toward the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said clearly, "we need to address something that happened in this lobby tonight." Victoria rolled her eyes. "As if this is about that misunderstanding." Mark turned sharply. "What happened tonight," he said coldly, "was discrimination." The entire room froze. Victoria laughed nervously. "You can't talk to me like that. I'm on the board." Mark nodded slightly. "Yes." Then he turned toward Emmanuel. "And allow me to introduce the majority owner of the Sterlington Grand Resorts." The room went silent. Emmanuel stepped forward. Victoria frowned. "What?" Mark's voice carried across the lobby. "Doctor, Emmanuel Carter and his wife, Nicole Carter, are the controlling owners of this entire hotel chain." Gasps erupted. Victoria's face drained of color. Emmanuel looked directly at her. "You kicked out the owners of the building." Victoria shook her head. "That's impossible." Nicole stepped forward calmly. "You didn't care who we were," she said softly. "You only cared what we looked like." Victoria stammered. "I didn't know." "That's the problem," Emmanuel replied. "Respect shouldn't depend on someone's net worth." Security guards lowered their eyes. Victor whispered quietly, "I'm sorry." Emmanuel placed a hand on his shoulder. "Tonight is about truth." Mark turned toward the Sterlings. "Effective immediately. Your board privileges are suspended pending investigation." Chadwick shouted angrily. "You can't do that." Emmanuel spoke quietly. "This isn't your hotel." He stepped closer. "It's ours." Victoria's knees nearly buckled. In the lobby slowly returned to a quiet murmur. Guests whispered to each other. Staff members stood frozen, still processing what had just happened. A few people stared openly at Emmanuel and Nicole as if seeing them for the first time. Just minutes earlier they had been treated like intruders. Now everyone understood something very different. Mark turned toward Emmanuel. "Some of them are confused," he said quietly. "They don't understand how this happened." Emmanuel nodded slowly. "That's fair," he said. Nicole glanced around the room. The tension that had filled the lobby earlier had shifted into something else now. Curiosity, unease, a quiet sense that a story much larger than this evening had just been revealed. Emmanuel rested his hand lightly on the marble counter. "You see this building," he said calmly, his voice carrying across the lobby. "Most people believe the Sterling family built the Sterlington hotels from nothing." Victoria, still pale and shaken, he looked up sharply. "That's because we did," she snapped weakly. Emmanuel shook his head once. "No," he said quietly. "You inherited the name, but the foundation of this empire was built by two men." The room went silent again. "One of those men," Emmanuel continued, "was Charles Sterling." He gestured lightly toward the towering lobby, the chandeliers, the marble floors. But the other man was someone history chose to forget. Nicole's eyes softened as she watched him speak. "My great-grandfather," Emmanuel said, "Henry Carter." A few employees exchanged surprised glances. Emmanuel continued slowly, carefully. "Nearly a century ago, Henry Carter was an architect and hotel developer, a brilliant one. He helped design and finance the first Sterlington Hotel." Victoria stared at him in disbelief. "That's ridiculous." But Emmanuel didn't raise his voice. "In the 1920s, he said, a black man owning a luxury hotel was something powerful people simply refused to accept." The room remained completely silent. "So, Henry Carter was pushed out," Emmanuel said quietly. "Not by contracts, not by fair negotiations, but by pressure, threats, and the simple reality that the system was never designed to protect men like him." Nicole spoke softly beside him. "Over time, the story changed. The Sterling name stayed. Henry Carter's name disappeared." Mark nodded. "For decades," he added, Most people believed the Sterlings had always been the sole owners. Emmanuel folded his hands together calmly. "But history has a way of leaving traces," he said. "Old documents, legal filings, ownership records buried inside corporate archives." Nicole smiled faintly. "Years ago," she said, "Emmanuel started researching his family history." "At first it was just curiosity," Emmanuel continued, "in stories passed down through generations. But eventually," Mark added quietly, "he found proof." The lobby seemed to lean closer. "Henry Carter had never fully sold his stake in the company," Emmanuel said. "The ownership had simply been buried under decades of corporate restructuring." Victoria's face tightened. "That doesn't mean you own anything." Emmanuel nodded calmly. "You're right. On its own, it didn't." He paused. "But it gave us something important. Truth." Nicole stepped closer. "And instead of dragging your family through the courts," she said, "we chose a different path." Emmanuel continued. "Nicole and I spent years building our own investments. Real estate, hotels, commercial properties. We didn't rush. We didn't announce anything. We built quietly." Mark smiled slightly. "By the time their investment group approached the Sterlington board, they already had the capital to buy controlling shares of the company." Victoria's eyes widened. "The board believed they were selling to an anonymous investment firm," Mark continued. "They had no idea who was behind it." Emmanuel nodded. "The deal closed 3 years ago." Nicole added softly, "And only a handful of people knew the truth." Victoria whispered weakly, "So you bought the company?" Emmanuel looked at her steadily. "Yes, but not for revenge." Nicole shook her head gently. "We could have exposed the past," she said. "We could have humiliated your family publicly. But we didn't." Emmanuel's voice remained calm. "We bought the company to rebuild it, to correct something that had been wrong for nearly a century." He looked around the lobby slowly. "And until tonight, we chose to remain silent." Nicole glanced toward the doors where they had been escorted out earlier. "But tonight," she said softly, "made something very clear." Emmanuel nodded. "A company's culture matters more than its profits." Mark stepped forward slightly. "And now," he said, "everyone here understands exactly who they're working for." The room remained quiet. But something had shifted, not just in the power dynamic of the building, in the story of the building itself. For nearly 100 years, the Sterlington Grand had carried only one name. Tonight, the forgotten one had finally returned. Henry Carter. And his legacy was standing in the lobby, alive, unshaken, and finally recognized. Later that night, Nicole and Emmanuel stood inside the penthouse suite overlooking the glowing city skyline. The tension of the evening had finally faded. Nicole stared out the window. 3 years, she whispered. "We've owned this chain for 3 years, and tonight was the first time the building knew who we were." Emmanuel smiled faintly. "My great-grandfather built hotels he wasn't allowed to stay in." Nicole took his hand. "And now?" Emmanuel looked over the city lights stretching into the distance. "Now, his family owns them." Downstairs, the lobby continued buzzing with the story guest would be telling for years. About the night a powerful family tried to throw out a quiet black couple, and discovered too late. They had just expelled the owners. Some people believe power comes from wealth. Others believe it comes from status. But real power is dignity that refuses to bow. And sometimes, the people someone tries to throw out of the room are the very ones who built it. If this story moved you, subscribe for more powerful stories about courage, justice, and the people who refuse to stay silent.